In the Bible, we find this word disciple close to 300 times. It's clearly a priority for Jesus. It's some of his final instructions to his followers before he ascends to the Father in Matthew chapter 28. Go and make disciples. It's a word, though, that for many of us is so common that its meaning can be lost. It can get a little fuzzy. And so there's a couple of questions that we might ask to try to hone in on what a disciple is and why it matters to this conversation about racial justice and reconciliation. So one of the first questions we need to ask is, what is a disciple? Dallas Willard is very helpful on this question. He says a disciple is an apprentice who has decided to be with another person under appropriate conditions in order to become capable of doing what that person does or to become what that person is. Now, one of the things to notice about this definition is that there's nothing uniquely Christian about this. It is different than how we think about learning and teaching today. And in our context, we think about being a student as receiving head knowledge. A teacher is someone who communicates information that can be retained and learned and memorized. But Willard helps us remember that in Jesus' day, this relationship was different. A disciple was someone who followed their teacher in order to become like their teacher, in order to do what they had seen their teacher do. And we see this throughout the Gospels, Jesus calling people to follow him in order that they would become like him so that they would do the sorts of things that they had seen him do. So I would say that a Christian disciple follows Jesus in order to become like Jesus, to do what Jesus does. Well, that then leads to another question. How are disciples made? Again, it can be our tendency to reduce human beings primarily to thinkers, to thinking beings. And so we assume that if we change somebody's mind, we're going to change their actions. But someone like St. Augustine knew better. In his well-known Confessions, he wrote, "Thou hast made us for thyself, and our hearts are restless till they rest in thee." St. Augustine is getting at this idea that we are not primarily thinking beings, but as philosopher James K.A. Smith says, we are primarily desiring or loving beings. Becoming like Jesus to do what Jesus does involves the reorientation of our loves, of our desires. Well, then we need to ask, what directs our desires? What points and orients our desires? And again, Smith is helpful. He says it's our habits which incline us to act in certain ways without having to kick into a mode of reflection. Let me give you an example of this. The neighborhood that we live in Chicago is a walking neighborhood. We can walk almost anywhere, the grocery store, the drugstore, our son's elementary school. And most of the time, when I'm walking from one of these places home or to a different place in the neighborhood, I'm not thinking about where I'm going. I'm not even paying that close attention to it. I just get there and then I get home. Some of you have commutes where you will have a similar experience where you drive your car to work and to home, and if you stop and think about it afterwards, you can't necessarily remember all the turns that you made, all the stops and starts. Your habits are what got you from one place to another. And that's a good thing. That's how we move through this world. Well, then we might also ask, what forms our habits? Where do these habits come from? And I would suggest that they come from practices, from communal practices. Practices are the routines that make our habits second nature. The routines that make our habits just the things that we do without even thinking about it. And these practices are then shaped and reinforced by what philosopher Charles Taylor calls a social imaginary, how we imagine the world. Again, we're not primarily thinking beings, thinking our way rationally through our days. Rather, we feel our way, we desire our way through this world, shaped by our habits, by how we imagine the world. Now, desires are never neutral. They lead us somewhere. They point us in certain directions. And I would suggest that for Christians following the way of Jesus, our desires are meant to lead us deeper and deeper into the kingdom of God, demonstrating and proclaiming that nearby kingdom that Jesus brought when he came near. So to our initial definition of what a disciple is, thinking about how disciples are made, we could say it this way. Christian disciples are made as they follow Jesus into the kingdom of God to become like Jesus through habit-shaping practices that orient our desires in order to do what Jesus does. Now that's a mouthful, but it's going to be important context for the rest of what's to come. Now I said a few minutes ago that there's nothing uniquely Christian about discipleship. And this is important to acknowledge as we begin to think about racial injustice and the segregation that many of us are waking up to in our white ministry contexts. I would say that another one of the discipleships that's forming us is racial discipleship.